What is this river we are trying to save? For me, it symbolizes all the living plants and animals on the bank and in the water, and this includes you and me.
Public Service Indiana is building a facility. They've already acquired the land about 5 miles downriver in Saluda Township of Jefferson County, of which Madison is the county seat. That will be a nuclear plant.
I went to college, to engineering school to become a nuclear engineer, and started getting pretty skeptical of the whole nuclear power thing. And ended up going into renewable energy.
I had a work-study job working for Dr. Hugh Spencer, who had a contract to do research for what was called the Ohio River Basin Energy Study. It was a congressionally funded study to analyze the phenomenon of all these power plants lined up on both sides of the Ohio River and clearly powering more than just that region.
There was two people that I'd met at U of L, neither of which were going to U of L. There was David Silverman and Ernie Markham, and they said, you've got to come to this meeting we're having to stop a nuclear power plant that's going in up the river.
Back in 1977, it was announced by what was called then the Energy Research and Development Administration that the Hoosier National Forest in southern Indiana had been chosen as one of 6 possible sites for the nation's nuclear waste disposal.
And I began to ask questions of one of the local wildlife biologists. He knew nothing of it, and the local conservation officer that's a good friend of mine knew nothing of it either. So I went on the site, and what I was able to pick up was that the drilling rigs, which were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, they were strange, just higher tech than anything you'd use to drill oil or water. And nobody could tell what was going on. And the only thing I saw, and I knew nothing of what this meant at the time, was the initials on the side of one of the vehicles, a station wagon that was there that said ERDA, which was Energy Research and Development Administration. And come to find out, they were planning a deep geologic depository for hot nuclear waste, for highly radioactive nuclear waste. And it was for power plant waste.
And that just seemed inherently stupid to me, especially in the Hoosier National Forest. That didn't seem like an appropriate use for the forest. You know, it would create a further waste zone than we already are. To become the center of the nuclear waste industry would be just insanity. So I formed a group called the Nuclear Waste Action Committee and started organizing on the ground.
We put together a group to let the public know what was going on, to inform the public. And as we did that, people turned thumbs down on it quickly, and we put together a protest in Tell City.
In the early summer of '77, we decided to have a rally in Tell City against this, and we enlist the support of the Tell City Area Chamber of Commerce and other organizations around the area to be a part of this thing we were doing in Tell City, which was really going to be a strong pronouncement that the region didn't want this nuclear waste site.
Didn't really know how that would be received. Didn't know how we would be viewed. I had a beard at that time, and we kind of were seen as a fringe element, maybe, I felt. But as the Saturday that we had that, as we rolled into Tell City, it was really heartening to see, as we came by the American Legion, a big sign on display in front of the American Legion that said, "No nuke puke in Perry County." And then we went on to have that rally or demonstration. And during the day as we were there, it was played on the radio. Birch Bayh came on the radio and announced in these exact words, "There will be no nuclear waste depository in southern Indiana for the foreseeable future." So that put that issue pretty well to rest forever.
Well, a victory is probably the worst thing that can ever happen to an environmentalist. You know, I thought, well, you know, I've learned all this about nuclear energy. You know, I should probably get involved in the Marble Hill fight too.
As we moved along and formed this ad hoc group, the Louisville group came up with a name for us that was a good name. Ernie Markham, Dave Silverman up in Louisville, they were kind of interfacing with Kathy Hargraves with the Friends of the Earth group, and they came up with the name Paddle Wheel Alliance. There was the Clamshell Alliance at Seabrook in New Hampshire, and the idea of an alliance implicating that we wanted to draw other groups in that had already formed. There was a group called Save the Valley.
I first heard about Paddle Wheel Alliance from a guy in one of my environmental classes on Indiana University's campus, and I had been involved with Save the Valley, and their approach was, I was interested in something a little more hands-on, a little more engagement.
When I was growing up in southern Indiana, we didn't put insulation in our houses. Energy was cheap. But with electric bills as high as they are today, it makes sense to go back and insulate our houses. More sense than building nuclear power plants at $5 billion a copy. Why, for the same money, we could insulate Indianapolis, creating a lot of jobs in the bargain. That's the kind of human solutions we favor at Save the Valley. Join us.
Our charter was to be in opposition to any power plant from Lawrenceburg, Indiana, to Louisville, Kentucky. All of the river sites. It wasn't only the nuclear industry at the time that was wanting location in this general area, because we had the river, which is a major component of most any generating facility.
Became aware that there was something going on back around my hometown, which was Louisville, and over across in southern Indiana at Marble Hill.
I began to see, hey, wait a minute here. You know, we're getting all the disbenefits of all these power plants, and other people are getting all the benefits. They're getting cheap power because the extra costs are externalized to us. And, you know, from an educational standpoint, you can't expect people to conserve things that they view as cheap, and you can't expect people not to pollute when they don't really even see the impact of what they do. So I began to see the ethical inequities of this whole thing.
When I found out they were building Marble Hill, and I pulled out a map at that time and looked at where I thought it was going to be, and it was so close. There was a Supreme Court decision on control of the river. Kentucky actually lost a major portion of the Ohio River, something we'd had since Kentucky became a state. And that was the beginning of just seeing how one-sided this whole thing was.
Slowly there became a core of people that we sort of modeled ourselves after Clamshell Alliance and the affinity group structure, and there were people in Bloomington and people in Madison and people in Evansville all sort of working towards the same thing.
A number of plants were already under construction, and indeed then we learned that we here in this community were slated to have a nuclear power plant.
You've been lied to, you've been cheated. After all these years, we are just what you have needed. We're the nukes, a steaming white hot source of energy. We're the nukes. We've had 30 years without significant casualties.
They were well attended, but they were very procedural. They were very scripted. Can't emphasize enough. They weren't really interested in our opinions or even our facts about whether Marble Hill was needed, whether Marble Hill was well designed, or anything like that. We could only speak about whether the proposed plant met the regulations that it had to meet by the host agency, usually the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, whom I can't emphasize enough was really not a regulatory commission but a promotional commission as much as anything else, if not more. And so we just kept running into dead ends there.
The hearings before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission came up in September of '77 in Madison, and we attended those. There were 3 days of hearings. We attended all 3 days of the hearings and basically saw it as a joke. You know, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was a joke. They weren't regulating the nuclear industry. They were rubber stamping the nuclear industry. They were polite, I suppose, in the things that we said. But here's how bad a joke it was. Get in there the first day, And here they are in official public hearing, and they don't even have a court reporter. All these people had taken a day off work to attend this hearing. We get there, and they canceled the hearing because they didn't have a court reporter. The next day was consumed mainly with people with the NRC hearing from the likes of Hugh Barker, and who was the chairman of the board of Public Service Indiana, and his minions, to talk about how wonderful this facility was going to be. Finally, on the third day, we got to speak, and they were kind of not nice to us particularly. You know, one person stood up and wanted to use their entire 5 minutes as a moment of silence for nuclear energy victims, and they said, no, you can't do that, and so forth. It was just not right the way the hearing was conducted.
Paddle Wheel organized people to go to the events and protests and stuff, but the folks that kind of carried the ball in that arena in the fight against Marble Hill was Save the Valley. They took the traditional kind of what I would call although they weren't in the Sierra Club, kind of Sierra Club method of trying to stop this thing. You know, hiring lawyers, filing briefs, motions, etc. And they quickly found out that nothing was going to work.
We were very active, and the nuts and bolts of it was to prepare and testify in open sessions in front of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC. Here were those three people sitting as if in judgment, and Save the Valley, probably the leader, and given no guidance as to what our objections could be as to admission or disallowed. We were pretty well organized, I thought. One after another of the opposition points was knocked down. Finally, an old lawyer that we had grabbed, spur of the moment, you might say, from Salem, Indiana, came over and explained how to make these things acceptable as contentions before the NRC.
I believe that Save the Valley was the only full intervener in the NRC hearings against the plant. And from what I read in the newspaper, I also knew that they had an attorney that was working on things with them in opposition to the plant. So I guess one way to put it is they were exploring all the legal avenues to oppose the plant. And so there was also at the same time little groups allied with the Paddle Wheel Alliance, and they were more into the civil disobedience and that sort of thing, and so they were. I was involved with them too, so I was kind of with both groups.
Well, basically, Save the Valley lost their case before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
It was not really a surprise, I think, to most everyone, and not to me. We figured it was pretty much a done deal and it was going to get through, but as we felt like Save the Valley did have to voice its opposition and do whatever it could. It was, of course, a bit disappointing that we didn't have any more success in the hearing process than we did.
And Downer. And construction, as you know, did begin.
Actually, construction started before the hearing even, and they got fined by the NRC for starting construction.
King of the hill, I get what I want and I always will. I'm king of the hill, well you may not like us, but we're building it still.
This is always a progressive thing. You start out writing letters, and I should be clear, you start out writing letters to the newspaper, you write letters, in this case to the Public Service Commission, and most importantly to Public Service Indiana. And you say, we don't think this is such a good idea, we don't want you to do this. And of course, the PSI people weren't particularly interested in our thoughts on that account. We did leafleting, we did fundraising, we had concerts to raise awareness and to raise money. And that's when I learned if you serve alcohol and you send a 21-year-old blonde with a coffee can, lots of guys will cough up money. Kept me up late counting the bills, which was fine.
It seemed to be general consensus that people didn't want it. They were afraid of water contamination. They were afraid of air pollution. We thought one of our big arguments was that the Ohio River belonged to Kentucky, to the high water mark on the Indiana shore. And they assured everybody that their pipeline would empty into Indiana water, not into Kentucky water.
We had done a series of demonstrations that got good press. We were getting our message out, and at every step of the way, PSI was moving forward, and it seemed like they were increasing their, they were speeding up their timetable. And it came to a point where there was nothing left for us to do. We had done all of the actions that we had available to us.
We have a three-legged stool of government in this country. We have the administrative branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. And it became very clear that we were not going to solve this problem through the administrative branch. We would go to public hearings, and they would instruct us. We could not speak about Marble Hill, whether we liked the idea of Marble Hill, whether we wanted Marble Hill. We could only speak to whether Marble Hill complied with their regulations or not. But of course, their regulations were designed to promote nuclear power, and frankly, they generally required a lot of legal analysis and a lot of very esoteric engineering analysis, and frankly, we just couldn't compete on that level. And that's the way it was intended to be. And so, since we couldn't do anything on the administrative level, and then the illogical thing would be to go to the legislative branch, but we couldn't get legislative officials, elected officials, to do anything against it. They just weren't interested. And if for no other reason than PSI was waiving these jobs in front of elected officials, and that gets folks to be quiet. It gets lots of people to be quiet. And you then go to the judicial branch and you say, I need your help, we need relief. And the only way you can do that is to file a lawsuit, but we couldn't make sense of that because they weren't breaking the law. That was the whole problem. So we had to do civil disobedience to try to force the issue.
Everybody started kind of gravitating toward the little town of English, Indiana, because it was very centrally located. Reasonable drive from Evansville, Bloomington, Indianapolis, Louisville, Madison. Everybody could make it to here in a morning's drive and be here on Sunday by Sunday noon or so. And we had a lot of logistical planning here and a lot of nothing you could call it short of quarreling about the best tack to take to try to get the public to understand what a bad choice nuclear power was.
I remember the day so well that the current leadership did not want to occupy, but Scott and Sarah did, and they led the group. They convinced the people who were there that day that we should do it, that it was a risky thing. We all might end up in jail, we might be fined $1,000, we might lose our jobs, whatever. But they were determined because they thought that was the only thing that was going to help.
Increasingly, as I got more and more involved in meetings and in talking with people, I thought, and coming to really like these kids, that just seemed like, the best way to support them would be to join them, and then it meant getting arrested. And I had been arrested before in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, so that wasn't new to me. I had been through, the civil disobedience training and had gone through all that. So somehow I thought it would be important to have someone who had been through that, and it didn't seem right to sort of stand back and sort of talk to them. It seemed to me that being part of it meant getting arrested with them.
It was kind of the consensus that The only thing that's going to stop it is just go up there and do nonviolent occupation. Now that'll cause a lot of attention, and they don't want to go to trial, because now if you go to trial, that means you can present evidence that this plan is harmful, and they don't want that.
Well, we were pretty philosophical about it. We required everybody that participated to be in an affinity group. The affinity group had to have at least one support person for every person that was going to do civil disobedience. So if the affinity group had 16 people in it, only 8 could get arrested, no more than that. All 16 would have had to go for nonviolence training, which for us was a couple of days minimum commitment. The affinity group had to keep meeting after nonviolence training up through the event so that we were sure that they were maintaining their cohesiveness, their communication, their sensitivity to each other, and that sort of thing. We operated by consensus, as in everybody has to agree or agree to disagree.
Consensus. Oh. Does everybody laugh when you bring that up? Because it was so time consuming. Fortunately, we had the time to spend to do it. But it was the model from the Clamshell Alliance, which was kind of the model on how to protest against a nuclear power plant. And the consensus aspect of it, I actually think it did help us in many ways. If nothing else, it made us talk to each other and listen to each other, which is kind of what it's all about. Instead of discounting people, just getting the votes to win, you have to actually listen to the other people and hear their arguments and talk to them about them.
And the notion was, it wasn't just going to be an effort to try and stop the power plant. We were trying to promote better ways of thinking and acting, and better ways of supporting a better society. And one of the ways to do this was through this consensus.
There is a need to get everybody's input, I think. And if you're dealing with a group more like, say, the Valley was working on the legal aspects of it, that would never work. I mean, you have to have some decisions made at certain times, whether to take this to court or do that or hire another lawyer, and things that sometimes might have to be decided very quickly. But it seemed to work for the paddle wheel groups and what they were doing. It worked very well.
Oh, I never went to so many meetings in my life. But that's what it took to get a coalition of people who felt like they were important, instead of being a boss telling them what to do,
If I was in a social change group now, and a Frontlines direct action group, which is really risky business, police lines, tear gas. If I was in a group like that, I would probably want to operate on a consensus method.
I was at the time a kindergarten teacher, and I had gone into my principal's office and told him that this was going to happen. And his reaction was something like, oh, I don't suppose I could talk you out of this. I said, no, too late for that.
We trained the police as well as ourselves. It was one of the myriad stones that we did not leave unturned, was complete categorical disclosure of what we were about, the point that we wanted to make, and how we were going to go about making that point, and who we were happy for them to know us by name. We didn't want any surprises. The last thing we wanted was for someone to feel threatened by us. I think it was probably 2 days before we were down in Madison having those last-minute inspections. We had a meeting with the police chief, and this individual came to, I thought, because he was our liaison, but the energy was very different, and I'm sure it was all very calculated. Now, looking back at it with my adult eyes, I'm sure that it was staged to frighten. They just wanted us to know what we were really getting into, that this had all been very nice up until now, and you you think you're prepared, but I want you to get the inside scoop, is the way this went. And they were in their uniforms, and they looked very official, and that was another piece of it, that when they'd been coming to nonviolence training, they'd been coming in street clothes, and so they felt more one of us. Anyway, there was rather this paternalistic condescension, new posture and tone that they had not taken with us in the past, and it was to warn us that they'd gotten, of course it's a small town, and everybody knows everybody, and there were rumors around that PSI was going to cancel work for that day because they didn't want to complicate traffic issues with whoever, whatever was going to show up and happen that day. But that didn't mean, because they had communicated this to the employees who were off for the day, that didn't mean that they didn't want them to show up for work, so to speak, and they were not expected to come empty-handed either. They were encouraged to bring whatever tools they might be required to work with that day, just to make sure that it was a festive enough atmosphere. There was going to be free beer for everybody. The police wanted us to understand that they were going to be there, but they weren't going to be between us and the disgruntled, threatened employees, and that they would come if they were needed. And the innuendo, all of the innuendo was that blood would have to be spilt for a Band-Aid to be required. I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I was scared, not that I wasn't going to do what was required.
We were so thorough in our planning, and that at that time it was like there was nothing left to do but go do it. And all the cards had been played. They had tried to scare us. We now had attorneys, and it was just play it out. It was kind of a feeling of celebration that finally this day that we had all been planning for so long was starting to happen, and for better or worse, it was going to happen, and we were going to make it happen. And we knew that probably, this sounds pretty arrogant, but the truth is, for better or worse, the Ohio River Valley was going to change after that day, one way or another. I mean, whether the plant was ever actually stopped or not, the dynamics were going to change after that day. So that was a good thing to know.
I don't remember that I knew that a bagpiper was coming, to be honest. And I remember hearing that and feeling, the soul quality of those pipes really emboldening my feet to walk. And then getting over the fear really quickly, looking into the beatific smiles on the faces of the people with whom I was walking. There were many more people there walking with us than were going to go over the fence. And the feeling of being held was profound. And thinking too about the years of work that had gone into preparing for this moment, thinking, I see it. This will happen, and the community will support it. At that point, we had stuff on our backs for about 3 days. It was supposed to be an occupation that could conceivably be indefinite. And worst case scenario, they ignored us. And we had to set up house and stay, heading into winter.
We carried ladders because we didn't want anybody to say that we had damaged the fence, because we weren't trying to destroy property. As I recall, one of the priests from Evansville gave some sort of a talk, some sort of opening remarks for the benefit of the media, probably more than anything else. And then we just started going over the fence one at a time. Okay. Total of 31 of us. And I don't think they let us cool our heels over there for very long. What I do recall was the sheriff had a bullhorn as well, and he made some announcement like, "Ladies and gentlemen, you are trespassing. I must ask you to leave now or you will be under arrest." And everybody stood there, and
our group mostly just sat down. We sat down and held hands in a circle. And the sheriff's deputies came and did Miranda rights statement to each one of us. They were very courteous.
The arrested part was we made it so easy for the police. I mean, and we did not, we were very cooperative. And I clearly got the impression the police were more uptight, not with us, but just in doing their job correctly, because there was so much media there.
I got on the bus towards the very end because I wanted to make sure everybody else got on all right. And so I ended up sitting in the second seat. And in the front seat was the sheriff's wife, who was the matron for the jail, and maybe even their daughter or maybe somebody else that worked at the jail. I don't remember who it was, but there were two women right in front of me. And she looked back over everybody in the bus as we were about to drive away, and she says to the other woman, "I bet they're all vegetarians." And so at some point along the way, she did ask, "How many of you are vegetarians?" And at least half the hands went up. So that she and the other woman were discussing what were they going to do with us. And that night for dinner, we got canned pork and beans. And I don't remember what else, but it was clear to me that she was trying her absolute best, and I thought it was very sweet.
Once they had read us our rights, they led us away and took us to a school bus, which for me was very appropriate. And then they took us into Madison to the jail. The jail was pretty nasty.
Even with being in a jail cell with all my, with several other paddle wheelers and everything else, just being in a jail cell was no fun. And it was, even knowing you're probably getting out the next morning, it was still no fun. So I don't think I got actually much sleep at all that night.
Cold, slamming, and bolts slinging shut behind you, and a feeling of, oh my God. It was nice to have sisterhood.
Across the hall, there was only one cell for women. And across that hall was where they put young men. And they brought in these two kids, I'm guessing 18, 19 years old, that had gotten into a fight. And they were still fighting. And one of them smashed one of them's face into the glass window, and there was blood on the window, and they hollered and carried on. And I remember thinking, this is why people don't like to go to jail. It's cold. There's a lot of hollering. You have to sleep with bright lights. It wasn't any fun.
Our bail was put up by the landowners in the area, and so there was a lot of local support for our action. And they put up the money, and I can't remember how much it was, but we were bailed out by the landowners. So
we were trying to stop it in self-defense. That was our claim, that we wanted to make. The lawyers were somewhat sympathetic to that, but were also more realistic about what we could get away with.
They told us that we had to use the principle of duress, that we did this action because we were under duress. We were fearful, we were upset.
When you go through the trial process, each side files briefs to basically work out what are going to be the rules of engagement. And one of the rules that got worked out was we were not allowed to talk about science or facts. We had to talk about our feelings only. And of course, that one was kind of like, wait a minute, let's go over this again. We can't talk about the facts.
The judge refused to let us use expert witnesses because we wanted to put nuclear power on the trial.
That was our angle, to make it public exposure. And he said we had to defend ourselves. So we were kind of up against it.
It was my first time as being a defendant, and it was really interesting for me. I mean, seeing, just watching the proceedings, what was going on, and the back and forth between the attorneys and the judges, or the judge and the jury, of course, and trying to watch them and see how they were thinking or not, look how they were looking, and what you were going to say when you were called, and how many people couldn't testify because they wouldn't allow expert testimony. And then of course, in my personal case, I remember it was planned that I was going to bring up that my homeowner's insurance would not cover damage from a nuclear explosion or incident.
What does the fact that your homeowner's insurance policy excludes nuclear accidents have to do with your belief set, Tom?
which I will object, Your Honor.
It was a situation where, except for a very few questions, there was an objection immediately.
I'll object, Your Honor, to which I will object, Your Honor. I'll object, Your Honor, to which I will object at this time, Your Honor. Your Honor, we object to this. Your Honor, I'm going to object to this line of questioning. Your Honor, I'm going to object at this point. Your Honor, I'm going to object to.
There are probably half a dozen different types of cancers that can be caused by those.
How did you form the beliefs?
To which I'll still object, Your Honor.
Your Honor, you did not even ask the question.
Our attorneys at the beginning of the hearing, it became pretty obvious that the guards could not identify who had crossed over the fence at Marble Hill. And it was brought, the question came to us through our attorneys, do you all just want to win this? I mean, do you just want to go, because right now we could probably go for a mistrial because they can't even prove that you were there.
The sheriff started arresting the first group. He arrested each one individually and read them their rights.
And you stood there and watched that?
Until he got the last group read, and then I started arresting the people too.
All right. And which group who did you arrest personally?
I have no idea.
I take it then that since you were yourself in the process of arresting people, how many people do you think you arrested that day?
The total number that was there?
That you arrested?
That I arrested, probably 8 to 10 of them.
Okay. And you were not, then while you were arresting people, you weren't in a position were you to directly watch and observe the arrest of the other people, were you?
Some of them, yes.
Which ones of them?
The ones that the sheriff arrested.
And which ones are those?
I have no idea.
And they just say, do you remember that person crossing the fence? And they couldn't remember them. And it's just like, how do you know they crossed the fence? Well, I know they crossed the fence. And then, of course, any sharp attorney would just eat them alive at that point. It went back and forth, and the attorneys had some fun with it, but then it just came down to, well, do you guys want to continue with this or not? And I think it was unanimous. We said, yes, we want to put nuclear power on trial.
Societies have faced the question of progress and its price. The built-in factor, what I will now characterize as the kill factor of nuclear energy, is that human life is expendable. Human life has become a commodity to buy and sell in the marketplace. And I say to you, it should not be so. We have taken upon ourselves the very ominous responsibility of deciding because civilization has some need, because of the conveniences which we have allowed ourselves to indulge in, that society needs to kill people to maintain that standard of living. If that is the question, I don't want it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, have you reached a verdict?
No, we haven't.
Okay. The court, of course, does not determine whether or not this trial will again take place, although you can be retried. I want you to know that. That will be determined by the prosecuting attorney of Jefferson County.
Well, I think we were surprised we were acquitted because, to trespass up there in a small town, that's kind of serious. But, on the other hand, the small town had to put up with all those coal-fired power plants and now a nuclear power plant, so they're sick and tired of power plants. The jury had a bias against the coal, and they probably had a little bias against us. They would rather have us than have the nuclear power plant.
People want us out of town, talking about my radiation, just because we might melt down, talking about my radiation. They believe what they've been told, talking about my radiation. They think they'll die before they get old, talking about my radiation, from my radiation.
What finally gelled people totally, you're going to get all that you're going to get except the zealots in nuclear power, and that was the incident at 3 Mile Island up at Harrisburg.
Meeting right after 3 Mile Island, we had like 150 or 200 people in this little small room at U of L that was way too small for all of it. It was just incredible. It didn't seem like my special skills were really going to be that necessary to move into the next phase, which is really organizing a cultural, opposition that's mainstream.
At that time, my parents lived in Northern Virginia, so I took the train. 3 Mile Island happened while I was home. And I discussed it with my parents, and I told them that I really didn't want to take the train back because you could actually see 3 Mile Island from the train. The first paddle wheel meeting after the spring break, I was just stunned because we met in a fairly small meeting room, and there were people just thronging in the room and standing in circles around, the people sitting down. And we had to sort of re-engineer what we did and how we did it because all of a sudden there were just so many people.
It was the hot topic, and students were open and showed up in force whenever we held rallies or had teach-ins or things like that. It was great fun. The challenge came when we recruited them as card-carrying members. Then the consensus process was challenged. But I think the consensus process could be challenged when there were 2 people in the room, and it just grew us.
There was a second occupation planned, and me and my wife both were very heavily involved in the planning of that. We were of the opinion that it would take, it should be planned very well. We didn't want anybody to get hurt, so we did go through training on, how to conduct these things peacefully. And for the second occupation, myself and a couple other paddle wheel members actually went down to the sheriff's office and talked to the sheriff and told him we were going to do this, so that everybody, it's not going to be a surprise, and we weren't going to do anything terrible, but, and they were real congenial, they were nice, appreciated us telling them, and that sort of thing, and then they'd be ready and they'd be there to pick us up when it happened.
We weren't completely acting alone because it was actually a decision by all of the alliances, if my recollection is correct, to all have an anti-nuclear weekend. And so we occupied Marble Hill, and we also had a march, and we had some other things that didn't require you to occupy the property if you didn't want to, on the same weekend that similar activities were happening all around the country. So each of us was autonomous, but the profile of what we were doing from place to place was very similar, and we were trying to draw national attention to the fact that nuclear power was unsafe and expensive, and there were people opposed to it, so we were trying to attract as much attention as possible. So the first trial did attract attention, and in the meantime we kept strengthening our arguments, and we thought that a second occupation with even more people participating might be sort of a more powerful statement and bring more significant attention to the problem.
Well, it certainly taxed the court system, and I think had said publicly, hey, if you come down here and go across that fence, you will be charged. And that's exactly what happened. So this number of young folks mostly, and a few others, did climb the fence, went over there, didn't get very far, and the deputy came and walked them back, and the school bus, if it's planned, school buses, 2 or 3, I think, and taken to the court. Well, of course, trespass could have involved incarceration at the time, but certainly this county wasn't prepared to incarcerate 100 people or 200 people or however many it was.
Yeah, they dropped charges against me. I mean, it was a big joke. So that was a very clever move on their part. See, I was the only person. That's not a group. the group is, you stick with the group.
Right.
You single me out, then that's me versus the group, and then they're not on trial, so then they lose interest. The lawyers were grilling me and asking me questions, so I'd be used to whatever they were going to ask me during the trial. So it took a lot of prep, and then they just dropped it. They picked on me the second time because I looked real scruffy. I didn't shave, I didn't clean up, didn't look good. But they didn't realize that I was a mechanical engineer and had a master's degree from Purdue, and that didn't look good at all.
Anybody who reads organizing, nonviolent organizing, raising the level of consciousness is for step one. To educate the people that there is a problem in Madison, Indiana. It's called Marble Hill, and let them know that what it is and a little bit about how it works. But then after 3 Mile Island, they're trying to convince the people that Marble Hill was a danger to them was no longer an issue. By that time, we had done step one and step two, which is raise the issue and let people know that they were in danger. And we didn't have to convince them anymore. They believed us. Then came the next step, which is a tactical way to actually stop the nuclear power plant. And that got into, nobody could figure it out. I mean, we had, the state of Kentucky was against it. That politicians in Indiana started being against it. And it was like this nuclear power plant had a life of its own. There was no way, nobody knew how to stop it.
While I was at Bloomington, we were gearing up for the safety hearings, which the safety hearings, of course, are, they're a technicality as far as PSI is concerned. They're going to get through them, the public's going to come in, they're going to raise issues, we're going to answer these questions the best we can, and we're not going to miss a beat during construction. Construction had already started. I was a union carpenter at the time. I drove into Marble Hill, I checked in at the gate, showed them my union carpenter's card, and said, I'm here to speak with somebody from Gus Newberg, which was the general contractor. They said, okay, go ahead. Well, I finally got directions to where the containment vessel was going to be. I paced off 200 feet due north of the containment vessel with a compass, took a little military shovel, fold-up shovel, out of my carpenter's box, dug a hole about 2 foot deep, and buried my carpenter's box in the hole. Well, inside my carpenter's box, beside my level, was a whole box full of fusees, which are flares like you use on the railroad. They look like dynamite. And on top of them, I put a Christmas card. And all it said was peace on earth. When I went to the safety hearings then, I said, I have information from a very reliable source that your job site has been infiltrated. Right now, you're telling us that everything's safe. Your job site has been infiltrated. There's a box of something ominous buried on site. And these are the coordinates that I've been given for that. And they dug it up, and there was no media coverage of it whatsoever. Not a word was said about it, but they got the message, I'm sure.
Once we had sort of set the parameters of debate about, do we really want this in our community? How dangerous is this? And then, people started being concerned about the danger. And then when they thought, oh my God, it is being so poorly built, it is a danger.
Right around the time of the second occupation, there were construction workers at Marble Hill coming out and pointing out defects and things like that, which gave us other openings to go through other legal avenues. And so I think a lot of people thought, myself in particular, that that would be more productive.
Those that had misgiving about a nuclear plant so close to our community would tell us what the day-to-day situation there was. And that was the start of what eventually was public, the perceived sloppy and dangerous construction of that plant.
Save the Valley said, we're here. If you want to be a whistleblower, we'll protect you. We'll take your information and be sure that it's handled properly.
There were more than one whistleblower, but I had personal experience with one. We respected these people's privacy and told them up front that, you know, we appreciate their information and we'd like for them to give us the information that we need and what they knew about, but we were not going to subject them to any kind of invasion of privacy or anything like that.
You know, I was going to college at IUS in New Albany, and I belonged to a veterans club. I left school and I went to work there to make money to get married on. You know, I was trying to put back some. And I went down, I had a day off, and I went down to the school, and there was a bunch of the old guys there that belonged to the club, and we got to talking, and I was telling them about all the things that was going on out there and how shoddy the work was.
That there were voids in the concrete because they were pouring at times when the temperature wasn't right, it was pouring down rain, you know, conditions where they probably shouldn't have been doing it. There was what they called the honeycomb voids in the containment building, which is one of the main safety precautions that surrounds the actual reactor itself. And so I thought, you know, well, that's not right, is it? And he said, well, it's not right in any concrete work I'd ever done. And I asked him if he would be willing to come to Madison and talk to Tom DiTillo, who was the attorney for Save the Valley.
Actually, he probably kind of tricked me because he said, well, would you swear to it? I said, yeah. He said, well, I belong to the Paddle Wheel Alliance, or it was either Paddle Wheel Alliance or Save the Valley. He belonged to one of those organizations. He said, would you come to a meeting and tell these people that? And I said, yeah, I have no problem with that. I have nothing to hide and I'm not lying, you know. And so it was kind of like a dare, you know, to begin with. He set up a meeting and I met over in Madison. And when I walked into it, I knew I was into something because it got like a court table set up, you know, with 7 or 8 people there and a court recorder. And they really tried to pin me down, which I just told them what I'd seen in the facts. And when it came down to it, they wanted me to sign a statement swearing to this and to the girl that was recording it. And I said, well, you know, I'll sign a statement if you'll sign a statement that you won't release this for 30 days because my wedding date was already set. Marriage license gone. I think I was leaving like the next week. I'm not releasing anything unless you agree to this. And I really didn't think there was going to be that much consequence about it, but there was. There was quite a bit. I was raised around construction. My father was a concrete finisher and started one of the first concrete finishers union in the Louisville area. And, you know, no job lasts forever. I mean, you can't build a bridge forever, even though they'd like to. And that's what these people thought, they were going to have a job forever. Probably 50% of the job was concrete, if not more. You know, you had your carpenters, your steel workers, but they were all building forms for us to pour concrete in and tying rebar reinforcement rods and stuff for us to tie the concrete in. We were pouring 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 yard pours of concrete. There'd be 30 finishers and 40 laborers working on a pour at a time. We'd start at 7 in the morning, and there was times we didn't leave until 3 in the next morning. I don't feel like that they did it proper because one of the big things on the walls and containment walls were honeycomb air pockets, and that got to be the downfall before it was over with. And what the laborers would do would bring them a mixture of what they called dry pack, and we just fill up 5-gallon buckets of concrete dry powder mixture and take it to the finishers, which would be in an area that's supposedly been air hammered out around the rebar, and then they'd pack it full of this dry pack. And it was like not a real wet mud, but they'd pack it in there, and then they'd trowel it off to where it just looked like it was the same wall, you know, the concrete wall they were patching. And that, we called it dry pack. It should had elasticity where it'd stick together when you hold it in your hand, and it didn't. And they called that dead cement, or dead. It was bad. It was old. It had been out in the moisture and environment too long. And they knew, we knew, it wasn't any good. But everybody was just running the paces because everybody was making so much money. Best money people had seen around that area in their lives. The one time when I did approach an NRC inspector, which we were told, you know, that they're here and it was on the bulletin board, and if you have a problem or you see a problem, come tell them. And from one day to the next, I made a statement to an NRC inspector, and 2 days later, the construction site had 8, 9, 10 levels. They went underground. And I was directed to take a bucket of this dry pack down to one of the lower levels. When I get down there, there's nobody there. And then when I start to come out, they're like tunnels, you know, this underground. I was approached by 4 individuals, and they were going to mess me up, you know. And that's the only thing it could have been. It was just caused that. And luckily, I had family members that seen what was going on, knew what was going on, and they came down behind them and persuaded them they didn't want to do this. I left, moved to Abilene, Texas, was married to my wife of 32 years now. The 30 days went up, I'd forgot all about it. I was working down there on a construction site. My mother called me at home that evening, and she was crying, and man, I could count the number of times I've seen my mother cry, and 2, you know, before that. Mom, what's going on? What's the matter? You don't realize what you've done. You don't realize what you've done. And I said, what are you talking about? Well, they lived out in the country, on a country road, and for a mile either way was nothing but ABC, NBC, all the local TV stations. Literally had the roads blocked. And they're trying to get in there and interview Mom and Dad. And my dad got on the phone. He said, boy, you've opened up a can of worms that turned out to be snakes, you know. And it was, he explained what was going on. And it just said, you know, it kind of freaked me out. I didn't realize that it'd come to this. Well, while I was on the phone with my mom and dad, the FBI showed up. And they wanted to know where I was at. And that's why he's in Texas. What's he done? And they were really hostile toward him. That next day, I was on a plane and was met at the airport. They stopped the plane before it came up to the ramp, opened the door, and federal marshals met me on the tarmac and took me off. And they drove me out to Marble Hill. Newburgh had their representative there. Steve Gaso was his name. He was a superintendent over the concrete part of the job. He was a Newburgh guy from the Get-Go company, man. And we walked around, and I made, God, I don't know how many allegations against the different concrete work and patchwork on the walls, and said where they were and everything else. And we'd go around, and I was going to these areas I knew of. And every one of them, the ones that they could pinpoint from my allegations, had little X's on them where they'd been tested, been x-rayed, and had their little code numbers on them and the dates, and saying, oh, A-OK, you know. And well, this went on for about an hour or two, going all down through and here, all these places. And it was starting to make me look real bad. Well, I remembered this one huge area of honeycomb, probably 12 foot, 13 foot long, 4 foot deep. And I'm talking about deep back into the containment wall, 12 foot long and probably 8 foot tall, of honeycomb that they just dry pack into. And when they put a dry pack on there, once it's trialed out, it looks like a solid wall. And I remember where this one was, and there was a piece about 4 or 5 foot long of a 3/4 inch rebarb, which is just a steel rod that they use for tie-in for the reinforcement into the concrete. And I picked that up and I started banging it on the end along this wall because I knew the general area, but you got to realize how large an area this is, man. I mean, this is a huge place. And I'm going bang, 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 bang. And these inspectors are like, this guy's done lost his mind, you know. And they're asking me, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I just kept doing it. And bang, 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 and then it starts going thump, thump. And I said, here it is. And I went down a little more and it thump, thump. And I just went nuts on it, started beating a big rod into it, and all of a sudden the whole rod just disappears into the containment wall. And then it was a whole different atmosphere. Steve Gaso, the guy that represented Newburgh, he disappeared. I really feel like they were going to arrest me if I couldn't show them or prove some of this to them.
And so they did start an investigation after that, and eventually they had a shutdown of the construction work in what they call the safety-related areas, which would be basically the reactor building and that sort of thing. And that closed them down effectively closed them down for a couple of years. They could do work on other outbuildings and things, but it really slowed them down a lot.
It was coming out in all the newspapers about Charles Cutchaw was nowhere to be found. He's kind of in hiding. Nobody knows where he's at after he's made these brash statements and really trying to make me out to be a bad guy. Well, there's a little local paper there at home called The Giveaway. And at the same time, in this little giveaway paper, here's a picture of my wife and I with our wedding announcement, where we were, when we was going to get married. But here they're making a big deal out of, I'm in hiding and nobody knew where I was at. I thought it was hysterical.
And that gave things time to kind of brew and to kind of get our point across about how much it was going to cost. And it just became more and more obvious that it was going to cost a lot more. It was going to put a big burden on the ratepayers. There was talk of even, some kind of bailout from the state for them to help them get this thing finished. And so it became a very political topic then. And so that extra 2 years there really gave us the time that we needed.
I'm king of the hill. I get what I want and I always will. I'm king of the hill.
We didn't believe that we would stop the plant on public health or safety threats. We always thought we would stop it on economic arguments.
The mathematical relationship supported by, I think it's almost 30 years of economists checking the real dollar price of electricity against consumption, tells us that very probably last year was PSI's peak year of energy production. And they don't want to know that.
Fred was an engineer and had been a business person.
He participated in the first occupation, and Fred had been pro-nuclear at the beginning. And after he heard the statements made by Dr. James Coughlin, who was the vice president in charge of nuclear for PSI, Fred began to doubt and did lots more research and ended up very anti-nuclear. And Fred's economic arguments were actually what I believe stopped Marble Hill. He bought stock in PSI, and he used their own figures in their annual reports and made his case against them.
I remember when I first started figuring out that Fred had a key. And he and I were having lunch, and we had known each other for years, and even though he had been feeding me this information all this time, I was just kind of sitting there complaining about, people don't vote for their best interest, that they're building this plant that may kill us, but we don't do, but nobody seems to be able to stop it. Fred just kind of kept handing me papers, and then he started talking about how much it was going to cost to finally do this thing and how much the ratepayers were going to have to pay. Something he probably told me every day I knew him. But for some reason that day it clicked. It's just like, you know, you may have something there, Fred. And he's a true hero of that movement. I mean, not just Marble Hill, but the whole movement against nuclear power plants during the 70s. It was his information that kind of got the fire lit that finally took the place down.
He was capable of telling us within a few dollars of how much they'd put in, how much they even had left to budget for it. And you could, he was right on the money, Fred Howe.
What has happened here is that he, back in 1977, predicted these figures down here. And they're now below his prediction.
I had my own private fortune teller then.
Oh,
I didn't realize how good he was.
Your private fortune teller was an honest computing machine.
Oh, we didn't have the financial incentives to kid ourselves that PSI still has.
Dr. Harold Cassidy, who was emeritus out at Hanover from Yale University in chemistry, and he had a huge background of the issues being discussed, those having to do with radiation, with the runaway plant, the possibility. And he contributed the science to the thing so that we, as Save the Valley, could address the scientific issues that they brought up.
He was a very well-mannered and peaceful person, a very learned person. He always thought things out. I would include him as one of my top mentors.
It's very interesting. We sat there and listened to this report by this expert with a big computer.
And the $425,000 fee.
Was that what it was? $425,000 fee. And I kept thinking of a biblical picture. I saw a whited sepulcher. And this sepulcher, of course, is Marble Hill. And I saw it whited and gussied up in the modern way by reams of computer printout from an obedient computer which does what it's told. And I couldn't help feeling that there was still, in spite of all this bunch of computer tables and tables and tables of whatever it was, I couldn't help feeling that there was still an air of morbidity about the whole thing. And that was the reaction I had when I listened to this hearing. Actually, the problem is very straightforward and simple. PSI is overbuilt. They have great excessive capacity right now. If they build Marble Hill, the prices will go up. And Fred can give you the word on that. It's really a very stupid thing that's going on and very hard on the public.
While we were still dealing with the issues of safety and there had been some delays because of the honeycombs in the concrete, the real issue came down to money.
When we went into the hearings, the cost of Marble Hill was supposed to be $1.4 billion. It had
1977.
Been estimated earlier than that at even less than $1 billion. But at that time it was 1 4/10. By the end of the hearings, it was 1 8/10. You ran across something about a year later that indicated $3 billion, and I thought Harold was wrong, so I did a lot of digging. And by that time, I found out, yes, he was wrong. I thought he was too high, and he turned out to be too low. That's when the plant up in New York State was turned down, Long Island Lighting. Same manufacturer, Westinghouse, same size roughly, at $4.5 billion. So we said at that time that it would cost at least $4 billion. Shortly after that time, PSI came up to $3.4 billion.
Yes, yes.
And then after that time, we needled them. We got more information and said it's going to cost about $5 billion. Then they came up to 4.3, billion.
I forget
I
what it
believe.
was.
How much have they spent already in building?
1.6 billion is best we can
In the
figure.
building, but they've also ordered all this equipment. 80% of their equipment is already on the ground, they say.
They say, yeah.
So they must have paid for that, and that's pretty expensive stuff.
Their credit went downhill and downhill and downhill to the point that no one else would give them money to continue their project.
You say, okay, so who is going to pay for this? I mean, there were only three sources of money. One was the taxpayer, either the state or the federal taxpayer, you through tax breaks or something. The other was the stockholders and the bondholders, and the third were the ratepayers.
Under Indiana law at the time, customers could not be required to pay through their utility rates for plants that were not yet used and useful. That is, in service and reasonably necessary for the provision of electricity to customers. So investors had to finance the construction of the plant.
So their only solution to the problem was to change the laws of the state of Indiana that would allow them to do away with the used and useful clause and allow them to put the Marble Hill plant into their rate base and collect money on it before it was completed.
This was something that Bill Julian and David Culp figured out. You could stop PSI from getting legislative authorization for construction work in progress, then you could stop Marble Hill.
Then really the focus shifted from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to the legislature. And really that's when CAC came to the forefront. And they were trying to get construction work in progress.
I remember coming in maybe the third or fourth day I was here, and I overheard a conversation amongst some of the organizers at CAC about this concept of QWIP, construction work in progress. And I said, well, boy, you can go out and talk to people about that. They'll understand that, you know, you're asking them to pay for something that they may never get any benefit from, that may never be completed, and something that'll completely take the incentive for the company to come, in, on time, under budget, and so forth. And we said, well, we'll try it. We'll go out and try it.
We'd go to a shopping center or to a grocery store and just stand out in front. And it's real interesting most of the time that, businesses don't want people leafleting and soliciting outside. But for this particular cause, there was the store owners didn't have any problem with it because it was their rates too that they were paying as store owners. So there was just incredible broad support from the public for what we were doing. And there was a need for someone to be in there to do the organizing. In other words, to get the word out. Yes, we now need you to contact your legislator. The things to do. So it was great organizing.
CAC was definitely in its element because now we're talking about grassroots mobilization. Now we're talking about public opinion.
We spent a lot of time figuring out which members of the legislature we had to get on board. I mean, we had limited resources. The legislature is a big place, 100 House members, 50 senators. Some of them, 100% we knew were on our side. There's other legislators that 100% were on the other side, and it was a complete waste. And so we spent a lot of time putting together lists of people in the middle that we needed to persuade. And frequently we would redirect the canvas to their districts. So we've got a particular member of the House, let's say, that is on the committee that deals with utility legislation. We would, and we needed that person's vote, so we would have our canvas go to that district and go door to door. We'd cover the whole district.
We were putting out in the summertime somewhere on the order of 150 to 200 canvassers. And the message was uniform, it was the same, and the reaction was incredible across the state. People got it. And we had lobbyists working in the State House, and they were unaccustomed to having all these people out in the field. And we started figuring out, from the lobbyists, they would say, well, this representative is really, needing to hear from his constituents. And we would start aiming the constituents at the legislators and the lobbyists would come back from the State House and say, well, wow, you can call the dogs off on this one, and why don't you go over here? We beat the construction work in progress proposals in the Indiana General Assembly 3 times. And after the 3rd time, that was it. PSI had gotten itself in so deep and was so far over its head. They spent more on Marble Hill at the time it was canceled than the rest of the company was worth. And I'm talking about every truck, every paper clip, every pole, every shred of wire. That's how deep they had gotten in, and that's how desperate they were.
PSI was one of the most efficient electric utilities in the country. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had all these reports, and they compiled some of the statistics of these things. Almost nobody had ever looked at these statistics, certainly not for PSIs. And I spent a bunch of time going through these, and it turned out that PSI was one of the most efficient electric utilities in the whole country in terms of producing coal-fired electricity. They had very efficient coal-fired power plants, and they had a very skilled workforce.
When they decided to build Marble Hill, rather than bringing in a construction manager who had experience in building nuclear power plants, PSI insisted on being its own construction manager. That was one of their first big mistakes. We can do it ourselves. We can take care of this. It consumed the company. It took them in places from both an engineering and a financing standpoint they had never been before. And it snowballed. One problem, turned into another and created others.
But it became, in the 1970s, really a status symbol to have a nuclear power plant. And if you weren't building a nuclear power plant, you were just not a real utility. So you go to your annual trade conference, and it's like you've got this shiny new car out in front, and the other guy's driving a beat-up Volkswagen or something.
Everybody knew it was a mistake. It was the only reason it was being built at that point was because of the money invested.
It wasn't Madison people who were making that money. It wasn't Hanover people who were making that money. It was people from outside. And the big beneficiaries of it were the big engineering firms, and Gus K. Newberg, the general contractor, who screwed everything up that caused them to have all these price overruns to begin with.
You ask them to make 70,000 welds and make sure they're all perfect, because if you don't, we might lose the Ohio River Valley, in terms of its ability to sustain agriculture and human population.
There were a good dozen utilities that all had gotten themselves completely over their heads in the Midwest and on the East Coast, and they were all roughly medium-sized electric utilities. And in almost every case, this was their first nuclear power plant that they'd ever built. And a bunch of them got into trouble financially. A lot of them got canceled. A lot of them did go into effect, but they were many, many times over budget. So yes, PSI made mistakes, inexperience, but they weren't the only electric utility that made exactly the same mistakes.
Now from people who seem to know better than I that it's an accepted fact that PSI will not come back heavy and accept it and force its subcontractors to be responsible to the contracts. In other words, they know that some of the contracts were not performed adequately, but they in turn will not demand cost reimbursements or anything. They're not managing well.
The form of those contracts are basically cost-plus contracts.
Explain that to me. I only read the watered-down version.
It's the same way that the Defense Department works. You come in and tell us how much you spent, and you're allowed a certain amount of profit on top of that. I mean, the original cost estimate was roughly $1 billion, and their current cost estimate is about $5 billion, and the contractors are basically simply allowed to continue and continue and continue, and it's on a cost-plus basis.
Okay, now let's move back there and just ask something. Is that sound management strategy? I always hear the Defense Department being ridiculed for its strategies.
In my opinion, it's not.
Who approves this management style?
Well, the management of PSI. I mean, the problem is the company is accountable only to themselves and their stockholders.
Okay, but then when it comes down to picking up the costs, I am accountable
That's
to them.
right.
It's a beautiful style.
The Public Service Indiana and the other electric utilities, they were quite desperate. I mean, this was life and death struggle for them. So they were quite determined to win and put a lot of resources into it. They were not able to step back 3 steps and say, what would a rational person do at this point?
At that point, PSI kind of gave up on it and said, well, we're going to go back to our favorite forum, the Public Service Commission. And what they did is they filed what was called the trended rates case. And trended rates was essentially an effort to get administratively what they could not get legislatively. It was QUIP by another name. The then Attorney General, who was a Republican by the name of Lindley Pearson, did issue an opinion which said, yes, that CAC was correct, that trended rates was simply another name for QUIP and was therefore illegal. That resulted in the trended rates proceeding being suspended.
And now here we are with trended rates on the shelf. The Governor's Commission is thinking it over until January 1st, and we're spending money, at the PSI spending money at the rate of millions of dollars a day building on that plant. Construction on that plant should be halted right now, tomorrow, while this deliberation continues until some final answer can be resolved, because the real logical answer is that plant should be canceled.
That Citizens Task Force, which consisted of 5 white men, all of whom were either CEOs or CFOs of major corporations, was expected to, come through with a resounding endorsement. Whatever it costs, let's build it, go for it. Certainly, legislature should authorize QUIP, so on and so forth. But that's not what happened. Those folks took a look at it and came to the conclusion that, as CAC had been saying right along, Marble Hill was not needed. Marble Hill could not be afforded, and basically both units should be canceled. And that recommendation was accepted and endorsed by the governor in December of 1983. Very shortly thereafter, the construction on the plant was suspended. The following year, after they tried to sell the plant, get private investors to take over the plant, when they couldn't make that happen, then the plant was permanently canceled in 1984. Once the plant's canceled, it's no longer construction work in progress. It's been canceled, so QUIP's off the table. But now what you're doing is they come in and they're saying, well, in the case of Bailey, we got $225 million here that we've spent, we want that money back. In the case of Marble Hill, we've got $2.2 billion that we've spent, we want that money back. And what happened was that the Court of Appeals decision in the Bailey case came down in December of 1984, while PSI's petition for cost recovery of the canceled Marble Hill plant was in its initial stages. So that cast a pall, to say the least, over their plans to get cost recovery. When the Supreme Court came down with its decision just before Thanksgiving in 1985, November 19th, 1985, saying that CAC and the Court of Appeals were right, that customers could not be required to pay for the cost of the canceled Bailey plant, even though that was not directly applicable to Marble Hill, it was only directly applicable to Bailey. It set a precedent which said, well, this is the same issue, it's the same legal principle with respect to Marble Hill as it is with respect to Bailey. So at that point, the company was quite concerned. At that point, the shareholders were quite concerned. PSI stock dropped by 2/3.
And I had 4 dividend checks. They were paying 25 cents a share. So each check was 75 cents. that I'd get because I had 3 shares. So I went to the annual meeting. They were on the skids. And Hugh Barker was responsible for those skids as much as anybody could possibly be. He was the one that was making the ultimate decisions. He was the one that was directing his board to build this plant. He was the one that was telling him to go forth, spend all this money. It was all on his shoulders. So I go to this annual meeting and sign in as somebody that wants to speak. So they were going through the cards, and they'd take the microphone over to people, and they would, a lot of people were complaining because their stock had gone to hell, and they didn't like that. A lot of people own lots of stock, and they saw their fortunes and their retirements and so forth dwindling. So they were kind of angry. Well, he comes to this one card, and he hesitates. He reads John off the card, and then he just stops dead in his tracks. And it seemed like an eternity to me. And then he says, Blair. I stood up and I said, I spoke as a stockholder. I spoke as somebody who had listened to everything that had been said before me at that meeting about this anger being expressed, about the stock prices being down. And I said, basically, we only have ourselves to blame for this mess we're in. We've let our management run amok, taking us down a path that was not going to be sustainable for our investment or the state of Indiana in any way, shape, or form. And I said, and we cannot allow our management to ask our customers to bail us out. That is patently wrong. We should not expect our customers to pay a premium for our mistakes. And I said, just to show our ratepayers good faith, I'm going to take my last 4 dividend checks, and I had fanned them out and held them up so everybody could see that they were dividend checks all around the room. I turned about probably 180 degrees. I'm going to take these checks and make them just what they are, trash. And I tore them up and tossed them in the air as confetti. And everybody was going, they couldn't believe that I was tearing up money.
Yeah, he was definitely the guy at the very top. And he knew us and we knew him. I certainly never had dinner with him, but we were involved in lots of hearings before the Public Service Commission. I mean, it was almost continual hearings over this issue. It was so much money. And so he was always a witness, and we would always be there. I can remember one time we were at the Public Service Commission. We'd been there for the hearing. We're on one side, they're on the other side. I mean, there's other people too, and then the hearing ends for the day, and there was a very awkward situation where we're all on the same elevator. And it seemed like that elevator just took forever to get down to the ground level. And Hugh Barker, he was on the elevator, and he visibly was uncomfortable.
The legal battles before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, and before that it was called the Public Service Board. They actually changed the name from the Public Service Board or Public Service Commission to the Utility Regulatory Commission because people were confusing the PSC with PSI, and they were feeling like they were getting bad press and bad feelings from the public. And the other side fought us with paper a lot of times. I mean, that's the nature of the beast too. Their attorneys are smart guys. They sat down and said, we'll just make these people file every motion under the sun. We'll make them spend so much money. I mean, they were out trying to figure out how to run us out of money, and they succeeded. Arthur Anderson advised their client, Public Service Indiana, that they had to take Marble Hill off the books as an asset. And as I said earlier, they were writing off $2.7 billion against what the rest of the company was worth. And where they ended up was about $500 million in the hole. So reporters would talk to me about, you're bankrupt. And I said, yeah, it's bankrupt citizens organization versus bankrupt utility. We were in Chapter 11 for about, I think it was 18 months, and came out the other side still intact, and went on ultimately over a period of another, say, 7 years in court with PSI haggling over the last $500 million that they had held on to illegally. And to this day, I still believe they got away with about $150 million of the ratepayers' money with regard to the Marble Hill debacle. It's been 14 years of litigation. We've been to the United States Supreme Court. That was with NIPSCO. We've been to the Supreme Court in Indiana numerous times, the appellate court. We had created, along with PSI and the other parties, the largest docket ever put before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. Docket number 37414. In the end, I recall $150 million in rebates. In addition, there was a provision for free electricity for every customer in PSI's service territory for 3 months. That free electricity wasn't just, it was to every household, every small business, IU, Purdue, you name it, Cummins Engine Company. Everybody got electric bills that said zero.
There were some really good folks that contributed more time than they could afford. And it cost them big because nobody got paid any dollars for this. Those of us in Save the Valley, Paddle Wheel, really sharp people that knew what they were talking about. And I would thank all of them from the bottom of my heart. So much of what happened at Marble Hill was basically drawn by numbers of people that had very little feeling for we the people, so to speak. And the noble folks were there when they needed to be.
You've been cheated. After all these years, we are just what you have needed. We're the nukes, a steaming white hot source of energy. We're the nukes. We've had 30 years without significant casualties. Radiation is our salvation, a natural way of electrical generation. We're the nukes. Aren't you glad the atomic age is here? We're the nukes. We'll be hanging around for 250,000 years. Melt them down, boys! Your appliances bring you pleasure. When we go full atomic, you can run everything forever. We're the nukes, a screaming white hot source of energy. We're the nukes. We've had 30 years without significant casualties.